Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our rescheduled first Wednesday lecture on the legacy of Rachel Carson. And wow, what a turnout. I love that you have chosen to spend Valentine's Day at the library. And it's very appropriate because, first of all, February is Love of Reading Month, which I know every month for us is Love of Reading Month, but you know, we celebrate it in February. Also, Russ reminded me today that Casanova's profession was librarian, so that says a lot. So we do have a few announcements before we get started. First, I want to let you know we had a last-minute spontaneous pop-up program tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock upstairs on the mezzanine in our local history room. We have a professional storyteller visiting from New York City, Dr. Joyce Duncan, and she has offered to come and tell stories in honor of African American History Month. And for those of you that have had a chance to hear a professional storyteller, it's absolutely mesmerizing. So we do have this wonderful opportunity. I know it's short notice, but if you have time tomorrow afternoon, please do join us in the local history room. And we have to thank Dr. Ava Sawadi for bringing us that opportunity. Next month's program is about characterization in the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Known World by Edward P. Jones. And so if there's anyone here who would like to read or reread that book in preparation for the lecture, we do have multiple copies that the Humanities Council has sent us, so you can borrow those tonight, and so you can be even more knowledgeable than you already are when you come to attend one of these lectures. We do have 30 copies. There are index cards in the books, so just choose a book, write your name on the index card, and leave that index card with us. Oh, and if you could also leave your contact information on that card as well. And because we only have 30 copies, and look how many people there are here, after you finished reading them, if you could bring them back as quickly as possible so we can pass them on to other people that want to read it. So, as you know, this series is brought to you by the Friends of Brooks Memorial Library, who are looking for a few good friends. And what better day to find friends than Valentine's Day, and what better place than the library? So I would like to introduce Joyce Marcel, the president of the Friends Board, to say a few heartfelt words.
Thank you, Star. I am here to hustle up 2 board members for the Friends. And if you don't know what we do, you're sitting in it right now. We raise money to support the Friends, to support the library in things that are not in their budget. So we pay for the First Wednesday series. We pay for the Foundation Center for Nonprofits to come and find money. We pay for special programs. A couple of weeks ago, we rented a llama costume. That was a new one for us for a very successful children's program. We do a lot of interesting things. We meet once a month, the 3rd Wednesday of every month upstairs. We hold events. We do a lot of fundraising. Everything we do is sort of fun. The next thing that we have going is the Journalism Film Festival. We're finishing that up in 2 weeks with Spotlight, Academy Award winning. And that's put on with a coalition of the Friends, the Commons, the Brattleboro Reformer, the Vermont Humanities Council. We organize, we meet, we interact, and mostly we raise money so that Star and the library can have the essential things that they need that are not in their budget. So we need 2 board members. If you're interested, you can talk to me. You can leave your name at the desk, and we'll get in touch with you, and thank you very much.
Alrighty then. To thank our other sponsors, other than the Friends who pay the bulk of this series for us, there are also statewide underwriters, the Alma Gibbs Donchian Foundation, the National Life Group Foundation, and the Institute for Museum and Library Services, which is funded through which takes the funds through the Vermont State Department of Libraries. And the underwriter of this particular talk is our own Chroma Technology. Please, 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 you know what I'm going to say, please fill in the surveys when you're done. Once again, funding is in question for the humanities, so they really need all their the wonderful testimonies that you guys give of how important this is in our lives here. So, at last, I am sure some of you have already had the pleasure of hearing our wonderful speaker tonight in the past when she delivered the recent lecture on E.B. White. So Nancy Jay Crumbine is a poet and associate professor of writing and rhetoric at Dartmouth College and a Universalist Unitarian minister. She holds a PhD in philosophy and 2 master's degrees in philosophy and religion. She has lectured widely, not wildly, widely, under the auspices of the New Hampshire and Vermont Humanities Council, the National Council for Aging, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and religious and education conferences, both in the U.S. and the U.K. And in addition to her published academic articles, she is the author of Humility, Anger, and Grace, Thoughts on Education and Time, which she has available for sale here after her program, and all proceeds go to support environmental organizations. And she's also thoughtfully, I think she must be a librarian at heart, she also brought a whole range of books for people to look at on Rachel Carson. So let's hear it for Nancy.
I'm not checking my email. I'm recording the thing. Let me turn this on and we'll see how loud I am. No. Yeah. Shall I move the... Okay. It's going to get wild, yeah. Yeah. I am really glad to be back here. I've been here twice to my memory, but maybe more. E.B. White a couple of years ago, and then before that, spiritual poets, Rumi and Kabir. And anybody remember that? Thanks. I'm making it up, but that's what you have to do, right? Okay, so Rachel Carson, the more I read about her, the more I reread her work, the more I watch her on YouTube. And by the way, you can see lots of wonderful videos. Can everybody hear me? Never had that problem. So you can just YouTube Rachel Carson and you can get a slew of amazing stuff. Anyway, the more I study her, the more amazed and speechless I become. I really get to the point where I don't want to talk about her. It's just I have such reverence and awe in response to what I read about her. One of the things I want to emphasize tonight, I'm going to go through her life and read you from each of her books, to talk certainly about Silent Spring at some length and the consequences of that, her really world-changing epic book. But I discovered a book a month or so ago called Rachel Carson and Her Sisters, and it's on the table. And unlike so many of the other books and articles that I've read about her, this book shows the extended relationships that made it all possible. Silent Spring would have been a bestseller, but nothing would have followed from that without the extended network of friends, colleagues who worked with her to make the environmental changes that were made. It's so important to understand this, that change doesn't happen with just one person. It happens in a room with just a few people, but it happens not in isolation. And especially, and the other example that comes to mind, of course, is Rosa Parks. The really brilliant writing about Rosa Parks in a book called The Power of Habit, and I can never pronounce his name. It's a very popular book. Maybe Starr knows it, but about how Rosa Parks' extended connectedness and her involvement in church with a huge network of people through church, through the NAACP, allowed all of it to happen in a way that could not have happened if she'd just been an isolated person. So I'm going to focus on that later on throughout the talk, really. I'm going to try to emphasize that. How did this, let's just start with this question, and I'm not going to be able to answer this question, but just to call up her spirit. How did this little woman from a poor, polluted little town of Springdale, Pennsylvania, this little woman, a graduate of a small, insignificant women's college in horribly polluted Pittsburgh. In those days, you could not see in front of you at high noon. How did this shy, quiet woman write a book that changed us utterly? How did this small Davidic voice, as in David and Goliath, Davidic, how did this small Davidic voice have the courage to take on the Goliath chemical industry and its complicity with the scientific community and the government? It is almost unanimously agreed that Rachel Carson began the modern environmental movement, not just in this country, but worldwide. The beginning of the turning around, we did hope, of our arrogance and destruction. We're in a regression right now, but keep the faith. I'm going to go through, as I say, I'm not going to answer that question, but maybe we can, during the discussion, we can maybe try to answer it. I'm going to go through the timeline of her life. How many of you know, how many of you have read Silent Spring recently? Not recently, I know, what a mean question. 50 years ago? Well, one of the reasons I give these talks is my mission is to get you to reread Silent Spring. It is not dated at all. It's more important than ever right now. And it's just a gorgeous piece of writing. And yeah. So, born in 1907 in this tiny Springdale, Pennsylvania. Her house has become a museum, I understand. I was very excited to travel there once I started researching her, until a friend of mine who lives in Pittsburgh said, "Nancy, it's very difficult to go. It's because you will park in the parking lot, and by the time you come out of the museum, your car will be covered in ash. The coal industry didn't do the cleanup it was said it would do, and it's still spewing." Springdale, Pennsylvania, the youngest of 3 children, distant, not so together father, an amazing mother, Maria Carson, who was part of the nature movement, the nature study movement of the era. Lots of women writing about nature, the importance of nature in the curriculum, the importance of getting children out into nature. Very, very important to understand that background. And Maria Carson saw in Rachel a brilliant young child who loved being outside and loved nature, and the reading she did and the fostering that Maria did was was extraordinary. Some books say that Maria was very possessive and she's the reason why Rachel never married. It's absolutely ridiculous from my reading. The reason she didn't marry was she was in love with Dorothy Freeman and I don't see any evidence that she had any interest in men all along except as colleagues. And Maria Carson lived with Rachel until she died in 1958, and Rachel, supporting the family, went out to work every day, wrote all night, and Maria, not only helping with the family chores, typed manuscripts all day long. So when Rachel came home, had dinner, went up to her study, she had a freshly typed manuscripts with all the revisions she had made, and she made extensive revisions, all set. So Maria was a very, very important part of, again, part of this network, but crucial to Rachel's development as a child, but also as an adult. So she went to this small school, which is now called Chatham, and it was my first teaching job there. Out of graduate school, I went to Chatham College to teach, and everybody talked about their most famous alum, and I didn't, I'm embarrassed to say, I didn't know who she was at the time. That's how ignorant I was. Well, it was a very long time ago. She was there from 25 to 29, and there were two professors that had a huge impact on her. One of whom you have to really struggle to find her name. Her name was Grace Croft, her English professor. Since I'm an English professor, I consider that the most important professor she had. And in fact, it was because her ability to write, which she had earlier, but because of the writing instructor and the close friendship, they were very close friends, is very important. And Grace Croft was just out of Radcliffe, as a new assistant professor, probably not much older. I was 24 when I started teaching at Chatham, so she was probably not much older than Rachel. And then junior year, the more famous Mary Scott Skinker, the biology teacher who pulled her away from an English major into a biology major, and then later in life, Rachel realizing that she could combine these two, as she did in all of her books. Because of Mary Scott Skinker, who went on to Johns Hopkins, Skinker got her a job at Woods Hole in Massachusetts, the biology lab there, very important, which was, by the way, founded by a woman. There was the first chapter of this book on Rachel's sisters is about all the women scientists that were the first women scientists at MIT. It's this fascinating history, and all new to me and fairly recently. Anyway, she went to Woods Hole for the summer, and that was an eye-opener. The first time she'd seen the ocean. She had never seen the ocean. And a very poor family, never traveled or anything. And then on to Johns Hopkins. But family's difficulties were such the family had to move in with her. And she didn't have enough money to finish a PhD, so she got a master's, but then she had to go to work to support the family. Zoology at Johns Hopkins. She teaches, she does various things, and then she gets a job in the U.S. Fisheries Lab, which then became the Fish and Wildlife Service when they merged with another department. Her father dies in 1935, and that's when the real weight of breadwinning fell on Rachel's shoulders. So she gets this job, luckily, because women were having, of course, difficult time getting jobs in those days, for the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, and wrote 52 short radio programs on marine life in the first few years. She wrote an article, her first article that she was asked to write was for the fisheries was so beautifully written that her boss said, a very generous, wonderful man, said, "This is too good for what we want. You should send it to the Atlantic." This is a guy in Fish and Wildlife Services and the federal government, bureaucracy. And lo and behold, she does, and they publish it. It's called Undersea. You can see it, get it on the web. It's her first adult published article, and that came out in 1937. She then worked on her book, after that, inspired by that, and of course the Atlantic Monthly was the place to be published. I won't mention that it was founded by Unitarians, but it's still a fabulous magazine. I hope you're all reading it religiously. Under the Sea Wind was published. She worked on it for 4 or 5 years and was published in 1941, alas, 3 weeks before Pearl Harbor. So it was such a disappointment because the sales went really well for 3 weeks and then boom, that was it. And that really set her back, her morale back. Now I'm going to give you some dates here. 1939, DDT was discovered. Had been synthesized before, but it was discovered to be a great insecticide, and was in fact the first of the modern synthetic insecticides. So just keep that in mind there. She was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service doing pamphlets. I gave this talk up in Middlebury, and a woman came up afterwards, and she said she had some of the original pamphlets that Rachel Carson had written, and that she was going to send them to me. And of course she didn't do it, being like me. But somewhere I have her email. I had to write her instead of nudge her. She went back to Woods Hole. She went to Chicago for 3 years, working there with the Bureau of Fisheries. And then she did some freelance writing and published several articles in popular magazines. Again, mainly to make money, but also because she identified as a writer. One little item from childhood that I didn't mention, and I want to because I have a really special book over here that I'd love for you to look at. She was, as a child, one of the great publications centered on nature and also publishing young authors was the St. Nicholas League. Has anyone heard of this? So just about every great author of the era was published as a child in this publication, in this magazine. E. Cummings, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Elizabeth Bishop, E.B. White, and Rachel Carson. So I saw her herself as a writer at a very early age, for sure. But so in 1945, she was very aware of all the scientific research going on in the field of biology and zoology. She learned about DDT, was very concerned about it, and wrote to the Reader's Digest asking them to publish an article that she would write. And they wrote back that it was just a topic that was just too unpleasant, and that their readers wouldn't like it. And they turned it down. And the topic took a little bit of a back seat for a while. Meanwhile, she had friends that she traveled with. Shirley Briggs is a name that is lost to history but shouldn't be. She went to Florida Everglades Refuge. And she went underwater in a deep sea diving gear. There's a new 2017 documentary put out by American Experience on Rachel Carson, and they have the video of her with, deep sea diving in those days. You had, what were these called? Those big globes? What? Helmets? Or anyway, it was, she's such a little thing, and this thing weighs about 20. I don't know how much. Anyway, she goes down the ladder. She's terrified, according to the documentary. She goes down the ladder, terrified, and gets down to the bottom of the ladder, looks around for a while, comes back up, and she's thrilled that she's gotten underwater. That's all, as far as she got. So, 1950, she has the first diagnosis of breast cancer. And in those days, it was common for doctors not to tell women, but only to tell their husbands the diagnosis. And if a woman didn't have a husband, she never knew. And one of the tragedies that she wasn't told, so she could have dealt with it more aggressively earlier on. So, 1950-51, she worked on The Sea Around Us, and which was published in 51, and that was an instant bestseller. It was serialized first in The New Yorker, God bless The New Yorker, the other great magazine of our culture, and of course E.B. White was very involved in The New Yorker in those days. More on him later. And it became a bestseller, and she won the National Book Award for it. It gave her enough money to resign from her day job. So she resigns in 51 from her U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to write full-time. She's honored by all sorts of medals. I won't go through them, in addition to the National Book Award. And she, in 1953, with the money from the sale of this book, she's able to buy a cottage in Southport, on Southport Island of Maine, the wonderful, most wonderful place. And here is where she meets Dorothy Freeman, who has a cottage next door. She and her husband, Stanley, and they become fast friends, the three of them, but especially Rachel and Dorothy. And I have a book of all their letters that the granddaughter published, and it's just so beautifully done. Her intro to these letters are just beautiful. I want to say a word about this issue, this historical issue. When I went to the Eleanor, to Hyde Park with Eleanor and, what's his name? Franklin. I asked we got a tour of the main house, and I asked the docent about Eleanor's relationships with women, and oh no, we don't know anything about that. And I said, well, and she said, and what does it matter? So I said, well, it really matters because the leading cause of suicide in teenagers is sexual identity terrors and fears and confusions. It's very important in history for these young kids to see role models. And if there are historic role models out there that we know about, we need to share that information. Then we went to Eleanor's house, and I asked a different docent, and I asked the same question. At this point, my family was ready to disown me. It's like, give it up, Nancy. It's all right. So I said, tell us about Eleanor and her partner, Hicks. And, oh, no, we don't know anything about that. And then I pushed it again. And why does it matter? And so I explained why it mattered. And at which point she said, well, there was a woman that came up the day Eleanor died and cleared out the house. Anyway, that woman is now, the story of their relationship has been turned into a one-woman show called Hicks, and if you ever get to see it, it's amazing. So I make a point of making sure that we don't cover up. We don't, Dorothy and Rachel at certain point went through all their letters, edited them, cut stuff out. We know that lots of letters were burned, just like Willa Cather. It's just the same old pattern. But the letters that have survived are in this book, and they are beautiful and well worth time looking at them and reading them. So, and then in 53, her third of the trilogy on the oceans is The Edge of the Sea that came out, and again, to great acclaim and very well received. Now, just to give you a little history, do you remember the 50s? I guess everybody in here is too young to remember the 50s, but I remember the 50s, and let's see, progress is our most important product. Better things with better living with chemistry. Chemistry was God. It was God. That was it. And everything was going to be solved by the chemical industry. So then we have some things happen, though. There's, let's go back to radiation exposure. In 1954, remember all the nuclear above-ground testing going on? The Japanese seamen on board the Lucky Dragon, quote unquote, dying of radiation exposure. That was all over the television that was brand new. Sputnik in 57 terrified all Americans. The Russians were going to take over and spread fallout everywhere. And Rachel Carson was very disturbed by the potential for evil and destruction, not from the Russians, but from all of these technological, scientific, quote, advances. The fire ants. Anyone know about the 1957 fire ant thing? Oh, we got a few nods here. So there were these fire ants that migrated from the south into Alabama, and they were really not that problematic, except they stung, and they made these pesky little nests. And so the government, in its wisdom, sprayed DDT all over the South. Alabama, Florida, etc., all over, millions and millions of acres, killing everything in their path. Very controversial, an agricultural equivalent of the atomic bomb for agriculture, it was called by some. Then there was the Dutch elm disease. You all remember that? Dartmouth's still fighting that, trying to save the last few elms on its campus. And in Long Island, to try to fight that, of course, they sprayed DDT all over the suburbs. And if you go on YouTube, you see these amazing videos. If I thought, I should bring some of these videos, and then I was like, well, I wouldn't have any time to talk because they're so amazing. These kids are having a picnic, and the truck comes by, spraying them with DDT, covered. You can't even see the kids anymore. Sprayed all over the suburbs, all over Long Island, and of course, again, killing everything in sight. And a group of people, a group called Against Mass Killings or something, Robert Cushman Murphy and Marjorie Spock and her partner Mary Polly Richards, organized a lawsuit against the spray to try to stop the spraying. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and unfortunately, it was thrown out on a technicality. Marjorie Spock, a sister of Ben Spock, did I just say that? A Brahmin family, very connected and socially minded. The research that was done for that lawsuit, because of Carson's connections, of this web of interconnectedness, she was introduced, her fabulous editor and agent, Marie Rodell, connected her with Marjorie Spock. And Marjorie Spock got her all this scientific data that they had collected for the lawsuit. And it was very, very important part of all the research that she collected for Silent Spring. Let me just go through. So 59, there's fallout, lots of talk about strontium-90, which is the chemical that is the nuclear isotope. There was a baby tooth survey in St. Louis showing this isotope showing up in babies' teeth. Then the cranberry scare of 59, anyone remember that? No cranberries for Thanksgiving because they had been sprayed at the wrong time. That huge controversy. And then 1960, Carson has a radical mastectomy and is very, very ill, can barely stand or walk. But she's working on Silent Spring by this time, and I'll go back to the agony of deciding to make this. But and the editor of the New Yorker at the time, William Shawn, along with E.B. White, decide to publish it serially first before it comes out in the fall of 62. October 62 is thalidomide, just to give you another. There was a lot of fear out there around nuclear fallout and around these chemicals. People were waking up. So the Silent Spring didn't come, out of nowhere, right? The research was clear that DDT was really dangerous in the 40s, but as soon as the war was over, they started using it domestically, and it was clear what was happening. But what Carson does in Silent Spring is she pulls all this scientific stuff together. It's very much like the climate change dilemma now. We have all these studies, and if you talk to any of the scientists, everything is clear, but who's pulling it together so that the average person, and in this case, she aimed Silent Spring at housewives very wisely because they're the ones who were buying things and making major decisions, and the ones that were most concerned, as their job was, to take care of the children. But to be able to pull this scientific data together and to translate it into language that non-scientists can understand, that was her great genius. Okay. Wow. I'm going to. That's enough of the timeline. We have a few more years to talk about, but we'll get back to that maybe. It's really another talk as to what happens after Silver Spring, Silent Spring. Why do I keep calling it Silver Spring tonight? Okay, I want to read you a few of her, a few pieces from her incredible works. Let's just do that, and then we'll come back. How are we doing? Does anyone need to stretch or sing or? Okay. I've been babied by a larger podium. I preach in Chester every once in a while, and they have this really nice pulpit that I can spread out. Well, I'm just going to... Oh. All right, let me start with the most tragic paragraph in all of her work, and this is from The Sea Around Us. I'll bring us back up, but this is such a beautiful paragraph, and you'll get why I feel so tragic as I read it. This is fairly early on in The Sea Around Us. And by the way, all these books about the ocean, they are timeless. They are so beautiful. I can't urge you enough to read them. And yet, man, has returned to his mother sea only on her own terms. So sorry, I have to go back a little bit. She's talking about she's referring to what man's done on land, not so great. And yet he has returned to his mother sea only on her own terms. He cannot control or change the ocean, as in his brief tenancy on earth, he has subdued and plundered the continents. In the artificial world of his cities and towns, he often forgets, this is man, he often forgets the true nature of his planet and the long vistas of its history, in which the existence of the race of men has occupied a mere moment of time. The sense of all these things comes to him most clearly in the course of a long ocean voyage, when he watches day after day the receding rim of the horizon ridged and furrowed by waves, when at night he becomes aware of the earth's rotation as the stars pass overhead, or when alone in this world of water and sky, he feels the loneliness of his earth in space. And then, as never on land, he knows the truth that his world is a water world, a planet dominated by its covering mantle of ocean, in which the continents are but transient intrusions of land above the surface of the all-encircling sea. I shouldn't have prefaced this quite the way I did. It's a beautiful, beautiful paragraph about the sea, but it starts out with, the sea is immune to human devastation. And of course we know now that it is not. Another description from The Edge of the Sea, her third book, 1953. This was dedicated to the Freemans, Dorothy and Stanley, the book. The shore at night is a different world in which the very darkness, by the way, she used to go out every night in the night with a flashlight and drag her nephew that she had adopted, that's a whole nother lecture, out at night and looking for things, and she'd bring them back, study them, and then she would go out midnight or whatever, whenever she finished, and put them back exactly where she had found them. The shore at night is a different world in which the very darkness that hides the distractions of daylight brings into sharper focus the elemental realities. Once, exploring the night beach, I surprised a small ghost crab in the searching beam of my torch. He was lying in a pit he had dug just above the surf, as though watching the sea and waiting. The blackness of the night possessed water, air, and beach. It was the darkness of an older world before man. There was no sound but the all-enveloping, primeval sounds of wind blowing over water and sand, and of waters crashing on the beach. There was no other visible life, just one small crab near the sea. I've seen hundreds of ghost crabs in other settings, but suddenly I was filled with the odd sensation that for the first time I knew the creature in its own world. This is so Carson to the T. I knew the creature in his own world, that I understood as never before the essence of its being. In that moment, time was suspended. The world to which I belonged did not exist, and I might have been an onlooker from outer space. The little crab alone with the sea became a symbol that stood for life itself, for the delicate, destructible, yet incredibly vital force that somehow holds its place amid the harsh realities of the inorganic world. How beautiful is that? Also from The Edge of the Sea. In the discovery of the biological role played by the seawater and all it contains, we may be about to reach an understanding of these old mysteries. For it is now clear that in the sea, nothing lives to itself. So Carson's best known for standing up against pesticides, saving the birds, and less talked about, but mostly understood, fighting for environmental health. The last 3 chapters are on cancer, which nobody talked about, linking cancer to the pesticides. But what she's really should be known for, more than anything, is the paradigm shift. She wasn't the beginning of ecology, but she was damn close to the beginning of ecology. It is now clear that in the sea, nothing lives to itself. The very water is altered in its chemical nature and in its capacity for influencing life processes by the fact that certain forms have lived within it and have passed on to it new substances capable of inducing far-reaching effects. So the present is linked with past and future, and each living thing with all that surrounds it. That sounds so obvious and simple to us, but it wasn't in 1951. It simply wasn't. And a member of the Chester congregation who did a service with me on Rachel Carson, a biology teacher all his life, he's now retired, he told me the story of when he was in graduate school and he did a paper based on ecological biology as opposed to the traditional form of biology, and the professor just threw it back to him as dirt. He said, "This is not acceptable. This is not the kind of biology we do here." I want to read a letter to Dorothy that she wrote February 1st, 1958, and it's about Silent Spring, her decision to write it. It was a lot of people consulting. She wrote to E.B. White saying, "Would you please write this book about pesticides?" And he said, in his wisdom and humility, "Rachel, I think you should write it." And only she could write this book. E.B. White would have written a different book, and it would have been amazing, but it wouldn't have been the book that was needed. She agonized about it. The editor, Paul Brooks, they called it the poison book. She'd written all these books as celebrating life. She really wanted to write the children's book, The Wonder of Nature, which is on the table, which was published posthumously. But she didn't want to do this, but she felt called to do it. And she wrote, by the way, because they were neighbors at the cottage, and they had their winter homes, lots and lots of letters, because they weren't together really that often. So the letters are a huge part of their relationship. Dear Dorothy, February 1st, 1958. About the book. And by the way, there's a note here that the first pages of this letter were deleted. So again, all the personal stuff Rachel and Dorothy pulled out before they were released. About the book, I'll see if I can make any sense about it briefly. Oh, and Dorothy was opposed to her writing it. She thought it would be a huge strain on her, and she didn't want her to write it. The theme remains what I have felt for several years it would be: life and the relations of life to the physical environment. The older ideas of dealing just with theories of origin of life or with the course of evolution were discarded long ago. But I have been mentally blocked for a long time. First, because I didn't know just what it was I wanted to say about life, capital L, and also for a reason more difficult to explain. Of course, everyone knows by this time that the whole world of science has been revolutionized by events of the past decade. I suppose my thinking began to be affected soon after atomic science was firmly established. Some of the thoughts that came were so unattractive to me. Does this sound familiar? So unattractive to me that I rejected them completely. For the old ideas die hard, especially when they are emotionally as well as intellectually dear to one. It was pleasant to believe, for example, that much of nature was forever beyond the tampering reach of man. It was pleasant to believe that much of nature was ever beyond the tampering reach of man. He might level the forests and dam the streams, but the clouds and the rain and the wind were God's. The God of your ice crystal cathedral and that beautiful passage of a recent letter of yours. It was comforting to suppose that the stream of life would flow so through time in whatever course that God had appointed for it, without interference by one of the drops of the stream, man. And to suppose that however the physical environment might mold life, that life could never assume the power to change drastically or even destroy the physical world. These beliefs have almost been part of me for as long as I have thought about such things. To have them even vaguely threatened was so shocking that, as I said, I shut my mind, refused to acknowledge that what I couldn't help seeing. But that does no good, and I have now opened my eyes and my mind. I may not like what I see, but it does no good to ignore it, and it's worse than useless to go on repeating the old eternal verities that are no more eternal than the hills of the poets. So it seems time someone wrote of life in the light of the truth as it now appears to us, and I think that may be the book I am to write. Oh, brief one, darling, suggesting... A brief book, darling, suggesting the new ideas, not treating them exhaustively. Probably no one could, certainly I couldn't. I feel still there is a case to be made for my old belief that as man approaches the new heaven and new earth, or the space-age universe, if you will, he must do so with humility rather than arrogance. This was her call over and over again, the incredible arrogance of the chemical companies, of the government, of industry, and they're all in bed with each other, of course, as we all well know now. I was pleased to notice that word in the little editorial on snow I sent you. And along with humility, I think there is still a place for wonder. In pre-Sputnik days, it was easy to dismiss so much as science fiction fantasies. Now the most far-fetched schemes seem entirely possible, and man seems actually likely to take it into his hands, ill-prepared as he is psychologically, many of the functions of God. I love you, Rachel. Here's from another letter near the completion of Silent Spring, near the completion of the manuscript. She writes, "No, I myself never thought the ugly facts would dominate, and I hope they don't." This is the other thing about Silent Spring. It is a horrible book in the sense that it goes through the fire ants and the spraying of Long Island, and it really doesn't hold back. And it starts, of course, with the fable. Do you all remember this? It starts with this idyllic town, and one morning there's no birdsong, and they're all dead. And it's a beautiful, poetic, tragic poem. But the book is still uplifting. It's amazing how she does that. So she's writing about this dilemma. No, I myself never thought the ugly facts would dominate, and I hope they don't. The beauty of the living world I was trying to save has always been uppermost in my mind. And that's just such a reminder to all of us as we struggle to face and keep fighting for the environment, is to keep uppermost in our mind the beauty of what we're struggling to regain. And anger at the senseless, brutish things that were being done, to keep the anger alive, but also keep in mind the beauty. I have felt bound by a solemn obligation to do what I could. If I didn't at least try, I could never again be happy in nature. If I didn't at least try to fight these horrible destructive forces, I could never again be happy in nature. But now I can believe I have at least helped a little. It would be unrealistic to believe one book could bring a complete change. I want to leave lots of times for questions and discussion. Yeah, so some of you have never read Silent Spring? Let me just read you the opening paragraph, just to get you enticed to read it. There was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. The town lay in the midst of a checkerboard of prosperous farms with fields of grain, and she's this beautiful poetic. Then foxes barked in the hills and deer silently crossed the fields, half hidden in the mists of the fall mornings. She goes on for another paragraph. Dried weeds, the countryside was in fact famous for the abundance and variety of its bird life, and when the flood of migrants was pouring through in spring and fall, people traveled from great distances to observe them. Others came to fish the streams, etc. Then a strange blight crept over the area, and everything began to change. Some evil spell had settled on the community. Mysterious maladies swept the flocks of chickens. The cattle and sheep sickened and died. Everywhere was a shadow of death. There was a strange stillness. The birds, for example, where had they gone? And then in chapter 3, the famous chapter 3, the Elixir of Death, she addresses it directly. And note again how she is able to make sense of all this scientific data. For the first time in the history of the world, every human being is now subjected to contact with dangerous chemicals from the moment of conception until death. In the less than 2 decades of their use, the synthetic pesticides have been so thoroughly distributed throughout the animate and inanimate world that they occur virtually everywhere. They have been recovered from most of the major river systems and even from streams of groundwater flowing unseen through the earth. Residues of these chemicals linger in soil to which they may have been applied a dozen years before. They have entered and lodged in bodies of fish, etc. And she goes on at very direct, specific, backed up with clear science. Oh, but I wanted to read you the last page, sorry. This won't ruin the book for you. But just so you know that she pulls it out. Through all these new imaginative and creative approaches to the problem of sharing our earth with other creatures, she talks about other ways to control pests than poison. The awareness that we are dealing with life, with living populations and all their pressures and counter-pressures, their surges and recessions. Only by taking account of such life forces and by cautiously seeking to guide them into channels favorable to ourselves can we hope to achieve a reasonable accommodation between the insects and ourselves. The current vogue for poisons has failed utterly to take into account these most fundamental considerations. As a crude weapon, now notice the metaphor she uses, the writing is just stunning. As crude a weapon as the caveman's club, the chemical barrage has been hurled against the fabric of life. A fabric, on the one hand, delicate and destructible, on the other, miraculously tough and resilient, and capable of striking back in unexpected ways. These extraordinary capacities of life have been ignored by the practitioners of chemical control, who have brought to their task no high-minded orientation, no humility before the vast forces with which they tamper. The control of nature, quote unquote, is a phrase conceived in arrogance, born of the Neanderthal age of biology and philosophy, when it was supposed that nature exists for the convenience of man. What a sentence. The concepts and practices of applied entomology, for the most part, date from that stone age of science. It is our alarming misfortune that so primitive a science has armed itself with the most modern and terrible weapons, and that in turning them against the insects, it has also turned them against the earth. Her later, after the book, so it was serialized in the summer of '62, published in the fall, instant bestseller. Book of the Month Club took it up. I mean, it was all the rage once it was published in the New Yorker. And of course, the chemical companies went at her ruthlessly. She was a spinster. What does she care about genetics? She got, everything. She was a communist. You name it, they called her. They spent in our dollars, millions of dollars fabricating stuff, trying to get rid of her and discount her. She, despite her illness, and she suffered horribly through finishing the writing of this, and she still gave talks, and until she died in '64, and she was given awards, the national and asked to speak the National Women's Press Club speech and the Garden Club of America speech. By the way, all these women's clubs, the Audubon Society, the Garden Clubs, all of these clubs were part of the political activist network that made this movement happen, that led to the EPA, directly to the EPA and environmental consciousness in this country. And many people have said, and it's true, the women in the Audubon Society literally started the environmental movement. And Rachel Carson was certainly part of that. She was also more radical than she let on. And there was a lot of talk with Paul Brooks at Houghton Mifflin, her editor, and with Marie Rodell, her agent, and all of this network about how to present this material in such a way that it wasn't written off as those lunatic fringe people. So when she was approached, so Marjorie Spock, who was apparently, I need a lot more research on this, but according to this book, she was pretty openly alternative lifestyle, quote unquote. She was kept in the background, and she's not even mentioned in the acknowledgments of Silent Spring. She was central to that. And she was central to the dissemination of the material afterwards and fighting the good fight afterwards. But Rachel Carson was asked she was very sympathetic to animal rights, which of course really out there, right? Still considered out there, alas. And Ruth Harrison, a British friend of hers, wrote a book called Animal Machines about the torture of animals in animal agriculture and the horrible treatment of animals. And she asked Rachel Carson to write the preface for it, or an introduction to it. And Carson did write it, but it made everybody nervous because they really didn't want her out on any of those more dangerous topics. One other thing I wanted to say, and then I'd like to open it to questions and we can talk. The other piece that made this Silent Spring such a revolutionary book and world-changing was thanks to Eric Severide. Anyone remember him? So, as CBS reports, Eric Severide was very taken with this book and supported it immensely. And he did an hour show, which you can see on YouTube. Takes you a while to find it, and if you can't find it, email me. But you can see the whole thing on YouTube. It's about 50 minutes. He did a whole thing on Rachel Carson in Silent Spring. He interviewed her. He interviewed the lead scientist, White, is somebody right? He interviewed all these people in the government, in the Food Administration, in the Agricultural Department, all these bureaucrats. It's an amazing show. They showed pictures of the spraying of the DDT. And his interviews with Carson were when she was really ill. So this came out, the CBS report came out in 1963. Let's get back to my timeline here. And TV was new, right? So, and all the rage. So, April 1963, it was aired. And he did these interviews, Rachel Carson, she was so ill. She was so ill that he didn't know she was going to make it through the taping of the interview. And he, in fact, told CBS that they had to rush this to press, whatever you call it, to show it, because he didn't know if she was going to be alive by the time it aired. And to watch this, to watch her, and she has a wig on, but you can't tell, and to watch her just calmly explaining things in this interview, knowing that she's in horrible pain and suffering terribly. She also, I mean, in those days you did keep your cancer to yourself, but she also really kept it to herself because she thought the chemical industry, which it would have done, would have gone after her. Oh, it would be given more fodder, right? She's just a bitter old lady who has cancer and she's blaming us for it. So she said that was all kept. And there's pictures also on YouTube of her testimony in front of the Senate committee. President Kennedy was very moved by the book and set up beginning of the overseeing. There was the beginning of what became the EPA. And there were Senate hearings and she testified to all this. Again, all when she was really, really hurting terribly. But the CBS report, because it was television, was the equivalent of 15 million books being read in 1 hour. Monsanto, by the way, was one of the lead companies that went after her viciously. In fact, they put out a book mimicking Carson's book called The Desolate Year, and about what it would look like if that you get rid of DDT and then insects are going to take over, etc. So Eric Severide is certainly a hero in this story. I'm going to end my remarks by an entry in my journal. I have lots more to read to you, but I'd rather discuss and I can read it as the Spirit moves us. I wrote this passage in my journal a little while ago. I'm on the verge of tears always, even thinking about her. Her delicate features, little body, bright, clear eyes, all of which I know only from reading about her, staring at photos of her, imagining her working in an office of hunters and fishermen. She seems so delicate, so elfin, and yet out of this fragile, dying woman comes this book, comes this stand against capitalism, against arrogance, in defense of nature, whom few understood to even need defense. Out of this frail, broken body comes voice, a condemnation of silence. Not only the silence of no birds, but the silence of those who would not speak truth to power, who do not speak for those on this planet who cannot speak. Out of this frail body comes the condemnation of the silence of complicity. Amen. So thank you for that, and let's talk.
I've lived here over 30 years, and I grew up in New England and grew up in the country and have observed, insects and birds and everything my whole life. And one of my favorite places is the West River. And I'm not the only one that's noticed. It's been disturbing how less insects, birds, amphibians, and it's, I thought, well, maybe it was an off season or something, but it's been like a decade now, and other people have observed the same thing. And the West River's written up. You mentioned the Audubon Society, and it is written up there. And I remember years, during special winters, that there would be rare Canadian geese and owl. It was just amazing. And it's just not, And
Did everybody hear her?
I just wanted to comment on that.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yes.
I can't hold statistics in my head, but there's in Vermont, I've heard. Can anyone quote these statistics? There's no question. There's a very serious reduction of bird life and all species, everything, and it's happening worldwide. The loss of habitat, the change of climate. That's what Rachel Carson is so timely, because what she's railing against is still here. Her later talks were so clear about the military-industrial complex, the military government industrial chemical scientific complex. They were all in each other's pockets. And we still have this. We still have research being done by the very companies that are selling the product. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
And the weather manipulation now with the chemtrails, which you're not supposed to say, is putting strontium-90 in the sky.
Tell us more about this. I don't know about this.
Chemtrails, if you look up in the sky, you don't see those crisscrosses.
From jets.
Yeah, from jets, but it's not
water vapor.
It's not water vapor.
No.
Yeah.
So what is it?
Well, there's strontium-90 in it.
Speak really loudly so I don't
There's
read.
strontium-90, there's some form of aluminum, because they're supposed to be like aluminum things that reflect.
So this is the exhaust from the jets? Is that what you're
It's
saying?
not exhaust, no.
No, I mean-
Huge chemical
But they're from the jets you're talking about.
containers in there that they've been retrofitted to allow these chemicals to come out, and it's supposed to manipulate the clouds to make rain, to not make rain. It's weather manipulation.
That's going on now.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I've read about all sorts of engineering nightmares that they've been proposing, but
Right.
okay. I want to know more about that. Yes.
I'm on a Google group where there's a lot of scientists and engineers and called subject matter experts.
Yes.
Talking about a whole range of carbon dioxide removal and reduction. And one of the things that came up today is something FIO I hadn't heard about, which is, OFI or something. It's oceanic iron fertilizer, to bring back the phytoplankton, which is 50% gone.
Yeah.
So you've been talking about the oceans. I'm thinking
Yeah.
about how we have destroyed crustaceans because of the acidity
Yep.
and phytoplankton, the bottom of the food chain, and we've decimated, somebody said 90% of the sea life. Do you know anything about that? And do you have an opinion about using iron filings or whatever to regrow the phytoplankton in a controlled way to sequester CO2 and bring back phytoplankton?
I've never had a question that I can less answer than that one. That really gets the point. No, I'm not a scientist at all. Can you say more about it? I'm fascinated by what you're saying. And it's very related to Rachel Carson, but I'm not a scientist.
So just this morning, I Googled those three words, FIO,
Yeah.
OFI, whatever, OIF, oceanic iron fertilization. And I found a book that was written about 2007, 2010, something like that. It's got a beautiful cover of a sun and it's all red. You'll recognize it. I recommend go in there. You can buy it for $18 in Cambridge. I'm going to buy it, but I went through and I glanced through it. And I think it's something we need to know about.
Thank you.
This is what people are talking about.
There are many engineering, as I said earlier, there are many possibilities out there that are also frightening, because what's frightening is that things are going to get so bad, in our lifetime they're going to get so even worse, that we're going to panic, and we're going to go, the danger is that we're going to go for one of these engineering fixes, and before we know what we're doing, which of course is the history of mankind, exactly that.
Can I say one more thing about that?
I'm going to
I just want to say that needs to go along with reducing CO2 emissions. They both have to happen.
Right. Thank you very much for sharing that.
I'm a tremendous fan. I've read every Rachel Carson book that's published, and the letters and the journal extracts in the Into the Woods.
The Lost Wood. Yes, that's a beautiful book that Linda Lear put out.
And clearly, in the sort of the immediate aftermath of Silent Spring, was a very powerful, transformative movement that we are still the sort of remnant of, in a way.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the effect of Silent Spring was not lasting, in that we're on maybe the second or the third or the fourth wave of new chemicals, or putting various weird things, proposals to put big reflectors in the sky, or these things. So the book is both powerful and transformative, and ephemeral in its effect.
Let's pull that apart a little bit. I think to say that it's ephemeral in its effect is to ignore the decades of the development of the EPA, the Endangered Species Act. I mean, I could go back and list these things as a direct consequence of them. There's no question that we are in a terrible backwater environmentally. But just let me just read through these, right? 66, Endangered Species Act. 67, Environmental Defense Fund. 68, Grand Canyon dams defeated. 69, the Santa Barbara oil spill. 69, Friends of the Earth were founded by David Brower. Greenpeace in 69. 70, the EPA. Zero population growth, founded by Paul Ehrlich. Clean Air Act, Earth Day in 1970. DDT banned in 72. Endangered Species Act 73. Fish and Wildlife Act protects no game species in 1980, etc. So there's been an incredible, compared to what existed before 1960, it's incredible what's happened. And the polluting, one of the things that I keep thinking about is, and I'm not a science historian or anything, but just from my work with Rachel Carson, prior to World War II, so a lot of these chemicals were developed in World War II. The chemistry industry took off in World War II, and they brought it all home. So in some ways, the problem that we're dealing with is fairly new. And we've taken pot shots at it, and we've taken steps sideways and backwards and forwards, and we're doing this, and then now we're in this horrible, horrible backstepping. But I wouldn't say that the effect of of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and all the people that worked so hard to get laws passed as a result of that awakening, I wouldn't call that ephemeral at all. I mean, I would be way too overwhelmingly depressed.
Even without the Trump administration, we're so much farther away from stopping global warming, for example.
Yeah, I agree.
There are
It's
so
not
many
just
things
Trump.
that have, yes, there are all these great alphabet soup organizations, but and all our consciousnesses are raised. But
Well, there are robins. You do have robins. We wouldn't have robins if that book hadn't done what it did. There are very concrete things that have happened. There is no question that the whole picture is desolate right now. I was in the midst of preparing this talk, and I walk into my local landscaping nursery, Long Acres Nursery in Lebanon, and it's all chemicals. The shelves are full of chemicals. You can't even buy grass seed that isn't loaded with chemicals. It's astounding, and so you're, in that sense, you're absolutely right. They've just, the industry, and this is why I very purposely, and I know it's dangerous to say, but I purposely in my last comment said that she was fighting capitalism, because it is a big, huge system. It's not just the chemical companies. It's everybody's in everybody's. Yeah.
I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. Does anyone else from there?
I'm so glad you.
Our bay was so polluted, and I grew up on the Delta specifically, and Dow Chemical was in my town, just dumping into the river where my Italian family had fished for generations, and then before that, of course, the Native Americans. And Senator Petrus, a state senator in California, along with others, influenced by this book, worked hard to stop the dumping of the San Francisco Bay, and now it is relatively clean.
Yeah, I grew up on the banks of Lake Erie, which was officially dead, and in fact, the Cuyahoga River caught fire. And it is now a thriving, living lake. It's a mirror. It's really a miracle. But I'm so glad you mentioned San Francisco, because San Francisco has one of the best waste systems in the country, in the world. And I know this because of a film that you all must see, and it will cheer you up a little. It's called Tomorrow, and it's about these young kids, well, 20-year-olds, young parents. They read the 2012 article in Nature saying that there's going to be no Earth for their grandkids, and they decide to make a movie. They go around the world, and they decide government's not doing anything, and the industry certainly not doing anything. So they go around the world finding little places where people are doing great things, and one of them is the waste treatment plan in San Francisco. And the interview with the head garbage guy is hilarious and brilliant. And they go around, and one of the places they go is a little town in northern England called Todmorden, and where the women in the town, scratching their heads saying, we've got to do something, we've got to do something. They went to the town and said, we want to plant vegetables, edible vegetables, in every spare space in the city. And they did. And a week after I saw this movie, I was in England, and I said to my friend, where's this little village Todmorden? Oh, it's only 40 minutes away. And we jumped in the car the next day, and we went. And we met Mary, who was the star of the portion of the film. Anyway, they go around the world, and all these, Copenhagen, the fabulous Viking paths, and they go around and to see what ordinary people are doing in their communities. And it is the most hopeful and wonderful film. So I really urge you to see that. We have to keep our hopes up. We've got to keep, and I think it's as depressing as so much of this is, Rachel Carson continues to give me hope. I mean, what courage. What courage. I can't even imagine what courage that was. And then to be sick on top of that. Yeah.
I just wanted to you mentioned capitalism a couple times, and I would agree with you, but I think we should be mindful in communist countries, East Germany, Russia,
Good point.
Beijing.
Amen.
I don't really think
Yeah.
it's about the system. It may be capitalism here, it's different
Yeah.
reasons over there.
Absolutely.
I think it's more about, and I'm not a scientist, it's more about
Oh,
convenience.
I'll repeat it.
Chemicals are about convenience, it's fast, it's easy.
Yeah.
Other things take longer time, so I think in both systems or whatever, it's really about, and it probably has a lot to do with overpopulation.
Yeah, for sure. She was saying that the problems, the environmental disaster is global, not just in capitalism, and I agree with her completely. And the issue is that we're addicted to speed and fast, quick fixes.
Profit.
And profit, yeah, well, that's the capitalism part, yeah.
A quick, easy question.
Yes,
Was there an overlap between, did Rachel Carson and Jane Goodall?
not that I know of. No, I didn't know, not that, I don't have any record that they met.
Or talked or?
Right, no, I don't have, I never read anything about that. But speaking of that, I'm reading today, and I have a great-grandfather, Samuel Crumbine, who was just recently honored in Topeka by a full-size statue of him. He was a frontier doctor, public health, very big in public health. My brother has a gold watch that Woodrow Wilson gave him or something. But he was honored, this big honor. I was sick, so I couldn't go at the last minute. But there's an award called the Crumbine Award for environmental public health. It's a very prestigious award in that field. And all of a sudden, I made that connection of, oh, this is the same field. That they didn't know each other either, but it's too early. But. Other questions, thoughts on anybody else who'd read Carson? Or any thoughts on? Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to tell a story about what happened to me a few days ago. I grew up outside Boston, and I had some time, I drove around the town I've grown up in, which was a small farming community, and is now, part of this western suburb business that was going on. Huge houses everywhere and paved roads. And finally I came across a little town, a little farm that had been there when I was a kid, and I used to go there all the time and get sheep and horses and stuff. It was still there, and it was a mess compared to everything else. And yet, I think what came across to me is we have to be able to be really messy to deal with this. We can't deal with it with beautiful green lawns and paved roads. It's gonna look bad to us in some way, or dangerous to us in some way, if we stop doing what we're doing chemically.
Yeah. Yes.
There's a gentleman on the upper deck who's been trying to...
Oh, thank you. Gentleman on the upper deck.
An observation that it started with the mentioning the number of birds that seem to be no longer here. And coming from Connecticut, outside the Hartford area, it's a pretty populated area. The number of birds there are way outshadow what we have here when we moved up here. That was one of the things that we noticed. There's probably any bird population up here. And we're living on the river, and it's very conducive to the environment for birds.
A little louder if you can.
Okay, that there are many more birds in Connecticut in our home.
Well, that's the problem. Connecticut's keeping the birds. Yeah. That's political.
Vermont to be this wonderful, enclave of environmental sensibility, and yet there's this contradiction.
Yeah, well, it's complicated.
Of bird life, for example. And that's not just bird life, that's a whole bunch of other things. We see deer tracking through the backyards in in Connecticut, all kinds of other wildlife.
Yeah. Okay.
No, there's lots of deer here, believe me.
Yeah.
If you have a garden.
Okay, there's another question over here.
One challenge that birds have everywhere now is cats.
Yes.
Cats need to be indoors, not
Yes.
killing birds. We have a neighbor with 3 cats. They eat everyday birds, even though they're well fed at home.
Yeah, domestic cats are the I understand, number one killer of songbirds, yeah. I get a lot of trouble with my friends when I bring that up.
I just want to say that my favorite book of Rachel Carson's is The Sense of Wonder. I work with children.
Yes.
And I just think that
Thank you
that's
for
like
underlining that.
the most powerful book that we can carry our hopes with, because it's really how to share this sense of wonder and nature and the beauty of
Yes.
the natural world with children, and not, children of all ages, from...
And that felt to her the most important. She felt driven to write this other book because nobody else could, the poison book. But it was so dear to her heart. And I have a copy of it here. Speaking of the next generation, I forgot to say my thank yous at the beginning, and I want to thank Star, wherever you are, and the wonderful Clara. Thank you. She spent 20 minutes on my ear getting the mic right. But I also want to thank a student of mine who drove down with me. And I want to honor her, Catherine Roche, because she's a devoted environmentalist. And I told her 2 years ago that I was counting on her to be the next Rachel Carson. And in my conversation driving down here, we had an hour and some talking, and I got caught up with her because she's been in South Africa and New Zealand and everywhere doing good environmental work. I'm convinced more than ever that she is indeed going to be the next Rachel Carson. So thank you for being here. And along with Catherine, I do have to say, if you work with young people, it does keep your hopes up, because there's some students at Dartmouth that drive you crazy. But there are so many amazing students who are so committed and working hard and committed to the environmental issues that were so dear to Rachel Carson. Thank you very much. I love this library. Thank you very much.